The wind on Lone Mountain had a voice. It wasn't the whisper of breezes through summer pines or the sigh of autumn across the plains. This was the shriek of a world being torn apart. Winter, 1879, had clamped its jaws on Wyoming and refused to let go. For weeks, the sky had been a bruised, colorless sheet. And now it was bleeding snow, a blinding, horizontal blizzard that scoured the landscape and erased the line between earth and air. Inside a small, sturdy cabin built to defy such furies. Another storm was raging. It was a smaller, more desperate sound, but in the oppressive silence between the gusts of wind, it was all Ethan Cole could hear, the cry of his daughter, Grace. It was a thin, reedy wail, the sound of pure, helpless misery. For 3 days and 3 nights, it had been the soundtrack to his waking nightmare. It drilled into his skull, frayed the edges of his sanity, and twisted the knot of grief in his gut until he felt he might come apart at the seams. Ethan stood by the hearth, a silhouette of exhaustion against the fire's flickering light. He was a man in his early 30s, built of the same tough, unyielding material as the mountains he called home. His shoulders were broad from swinging an axe, his hands calloused from leather reins and splintered wood. There was a quiet strength in the set of his jaw, a steadiness in his gray eyes that spoke of a man who didn't flinch from hardship. But now, that steadiness was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look of desperation. His flannel shirt was rumpled, his dark hair uncombed, and a 3-day stubble shadowed his face, making him look more like a hunted man than a homesteader. In a cradle near the fire, the source of the storm wailed. Grace was 3 months old, a tiny bundle of fury and hunger wrapped in a wool blanket. She was all he had left of Eleanor. She had her mother's shock of dark hair and, he thought, her stubborn chin. But right now, all she had was a gaping, screaming mouth and fists that flailed at a world that had offered her nothing but cold and emptiness. "Hush now, little one," Ethan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was lost in her cries. "Hush, Gracie. Daddy's here." The words were ash in his mouth. He was here, yes, but what good was that he was failing her? He was failing Eleanor. He picked her up, his large, rough hands almost swallowing her small frame. The crying intensified, her back arching, her face turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. He held her against his shoulder, rocking with a slow, mechanical rhythm that offered no comfort to either of them. The smell of soured milk and desperation clung to them both. On the small table beside the hearth sat the evidence of his failure, a tin cup of goat's milk, now cold. He'd tried everything. He'd warmed it to the exact temperature of his own skin, just as the doctor in Sage Creek had instructed before the snows came. He'd tried a strip of clean linen soaked in the milk, a trick he'd heard from an old trapper. He'd even tried to fashion a crude nipple from a piece of soft leather, boiling it until it was pliable. Grace would have none of it. The moment the foreign taste touched her lips, she would recoil, her cries escalating from misery to outrage. She was starving, he knew it. He could see it in the way her skin seemed too loose for her tiny bones, in the sunken look around her eyes. She was wasting away before his very eyes, and the one thing that could save her was the one thing he could not provide. 3 months ago, this cabin had been filled with a different sound, Eleanor's laughter. He could still see her, her belly swollen with promise, her face glowing as she sat in the rocking chair, sewing tiny garments. She had filled this sparse, lonely place with warmth, with color, with a future he could almost taste. They had planned it all. The fields he would clear come spring, the extra room he would build for the baby. They'd talked of siblings, of a life carved out of this wilderness, a legacy. Then Grace was born, a squalling, beautiful miracle in the pale light of dawn. Their joy was a thing so pure and bright, it felt holy. But the joy had been fleeting. A shadow had fallen over their celebration, a fever that came on swiftly and cruelly, stealing the light from Eleanor's eyes and the strength from her body. The doctor had called it childbed fever, a name too gentle for the vicious thief it was. Ethan had held her hand, watching helplessly as she slipped away from him, her last breath a whispered promise he was forced to make. Take care of our girl, Ethan. Love her for both of us. Now, her rocking chair sat empty by the window, a silent monument to all he had lost, and the baby she had given her life for was dying in his arms. The man's logic he'd always relied on, the practical, step-by-step reasoning that allowed him to build a home and work a farm, was useless here. You couldn't reason with a starving infant. You couldn't build a solution out of logs and nails. He was trapped in a prison of love and powerlessness, the twin instincts of fatherhood and survival at war with the crushing reality of his inadequacy. He was a man who could face down a grizzly, who could survive a winter that would kill lesser men, but he could not solve the simple, primal equation of a hungry child. Grace's cries hitched, turning into ragged, desperate gasps for air. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ethan's exhaustion. He looked down at her, his heart clenching. He couldn't lose her. He would not lose her. Losing Eleanor had shattered his world. Losing Grace would obliterate what little was left. An idea, born of absolute desperation, had taken root in his mind the day before. An idea so humbling, so contrary to his solitary, self-reliant nature, that he had fought it for hours. But Grace's weakening cries had stripped away his pride, layer by painful layer, until only the raw fear remained. With a final, soothing pat on her back, he laid the still sobbing baby back in her cradle. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, his worn boots, and his fur-lined hat, his movements stiff with cold and fatigue. He grabbed a piece of scrap wood from the kindling box and a stub of charcoal from the hearth. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he wrote. The letters were crude, stark, and black against the pale wood. Need help. Infant hungry. He paused, the charcoal hovering over the board. The next words were the hardest. They felt like a betrayal of Eleanor, an admission of his own profound failure as a man, as a husband, as a father. But he wrote them anyway, because Grace's life depended on it. Mother's milk needed. He didn't read them over. He couldn't. He strode to the cabin door and plunged into the maelstrom outside. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving icy needles of snow into his exposed skin. The world was a churning vortex of white. He could barely see the fence line, just a few yards away. He trudged through the deepening drifts, his head bowed against the gale. The cold was a living thing, seeping through his coat, leaching the warmth from his bones. He reached the gate at the end of his short, snow-choked lane. No one had passed this way in a week. The road to Sage Creek was likely impassable. Anyone with a lick of sense was hunkered down by their own fire, waiting for the storm to break. Still, he had to try. It was the only thing left. With numb fingers, he took a length of twine from his pocket and tied the wooden sign to the top rail of the gate. It twisted and swung wildly in the wind, a desperate flag of surrender. He stared at it for a long moment, the black letters already beginning to blur under a film of melting snow, a plea to a deaf and blind world. Then he turned and fought his way back to the cabin, the wind shoving him from behind as if eager to be rid of him. He slammed the door shut, the sound of the blizzard instantly muffled to a low, mournful howl. The relative warmth of the cabin enveloped him, but it brought no comfort. Grace was still crying, her wails a rhythm of despair. He spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation. He tended the fire. He checked on the horses and the single milk goat in the small, sturdy barn, their quiet animal presence a stark contrast to the turmoil in the cabin. He tried, again and again, to feed Grace. His efforts met with the same frantic rejection, and he watched the gate. Through the small, frost-rimmed window, he watched. He watched as the snow piled up around the fence posts. He watched as the sign he had hung with his last sliver of hope slowly, inexorably, disappeared under a blanket of white. Each flake that fell felt like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. No one was coming. As dusk bled into a deep, impenetrable night, the storm seemed to gather its strength for a final, furious assault. The wind shrieked and clawed at the cabin, rattling the window panes and sending puffs of smoke billowing from the hearth. Inside, Ethan sat in the rocking chair, her rocking chair holding his daughter. He was beyond exhausted. A strange, terrifying calm was settling over him. He had done all he could. He had fought. He had tried. He had swallowed his pride and begged the empty, storm-tossed world for help. And the world had not answered. Grace's cries had subsided into weak, whimpering hiccups. Her eyes were closed, her small chest barely rising and falling. She was giving up. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he whispered into the dim, firelit room. The words were a ragged tear in the fabric of the silence. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to do. I tried. I really tried." He rocked back and forth, holding the fragile weight of his world in his arms. The fire crackled. The wind howled its lonely, desolate song. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime and stubble on his cheek. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. A man on a mountain adrift in a sea of white, watching the last ember of his hope fade into darkness. It was over. He had failed. In the hollow space where hope had died, there was only the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair and the howl of the wind. Ethan Cole held his daughter, feeling the last of his strength ebb away into the vast, frozen emptiness. His world had shrunk to this single, desperate point, the barely perceptible rise and fall of a tiny chest beneath his hand. He was adrift, waiting for an end that felt both terrifying and merciful. Then he heard it. A sound so out of place it didn't register at first. A dull thump, swallowed almost immediately by a gust that rattled the walls. He dismissed it as a branch, heavy with ice, crashing against the roof. Or maybe his mind, frayed and starved for sleep, was finally starting to conjure ghosts from the storm. He bent his head lower over Grace, trying to shield her with his own fading warmth. Thump, thump, thump. This time it was clearer, more deliberate. Not the random violence of the blizzard, but the measured cadence of a human hand. Someone was at his door. Ethan's body went rigid. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude in a land that was beautiful but never truly safe, screamed danger. No honest traveler would be out on a night like this. The roads were gone, buried under feet of snow. Only a fool or a man with malice in his heart would brave such a storm. His mind conjured images of outlaws, desperate and freezing, looking for shelter to rob and a fire to warm their hands before they slit his throat. He stayed perfectly still, his breath held tight in his chest. Maybe if he was quiet, they would think the cabin was empty and move on. He prayed for it. But beneath the prayer, another, more treacherous thought took root. What if its help? It was an insane, impossible notion, a dying ember of the hope he thought had been extinguished. As if in answer, Grace stirred in his arms. She let out a weak, sputtering cry, a sound of pure misery that cut through the night. The sound was a death sentence if there was danger outside, and a final, desperate plea if there was not. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. Thump, thump, thump! A voice, thin and strained, was carried on the wind, the words torn to shreds, but the feminine pitch unmistakable. A woman! Suspicion warred with a wild, burgeoning desperation. A woman alone in this, it made even less sense. A trap, a decoy. He laid Grace gently back in her cradle, her whimpers following him as he moved. His hand closed around the cold, familiar stock of the Winchester leaning against the wall. The rifle was an extension of his arm, a tool as essential to his survival as an axe or a plow. He moved silently to the door, the heavy bar feeling cold and solid under his hand. Grace cried out again, a thin, wavering thread of sound. It was the sound that made his decision. Danger was a possibility. Her starvation was a certainty. He couldn't let her die for a fear of what might be. With his left hand, he lifted the bar. With his right, he leveled the rifle, his thumb resting on the hammer. He pulled the door inward. The storm lunged into the cabin like a hungry animal. A vortex of snow and wind exploded into the room, scattering ashes from the hearth and threatening to extinguish the lamps. And in the heart of it stood a figure, less a person than a specter of the blizzard itself. It was a woman, bent against the gale, her form nearly lost in the swirling white. She was covered head to foot in snow, her shawl and dress frozen stiff, her hair, where it escaped her bonnet, caked with ice. She stumbled forward, across the threshold, and collapsed to her knees on the cabin floor. So exhausted, she didn't seem to notice the rifle aimed at her chest. Ethan slammed the door shut, cutting off the storm's assault. In the sudden, ringing silence, there was only the sound of the woman's ragged breathing and Grace's persistent whimpering. He kept the rifle steady. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. The woman pushed back her frozen bonnet. Her face was pale as milk, lips tinged with blue. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes, but the eyes themselves were a clear, startling blue. And they held no fear, only a weariness so profound it seemed to sink into her bones. She looked to be about his age, maybe a few years younger. "Abigail," she breathed, her voice cracking. "Abigail Hayes, my wagon. It went off the road. Miles back. The horse broke its leg. I saw the light from your lamp." She looked up at him, then at the rifle, and a flicker of awareness crossed her face. "I mean you no harm. I just need a fire, a moment to get warm before I freeze." Ethan's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. His mind was a battlefield. Her story was plausible, but the timing felt like a cruel trick of fate. He was a man drowning, and the world had thrown him not a rope, but a riddle. Then Grace cried again. It was a weak, hopeless sound, but it changed everything. Abigail's head snapped toward the cradle. Her weary expression dissolved, replaced by something else entirely, a look of sharp, visceral focus. Her gaze locked onto the small, writhing bundle. All the exhaustion seemed to fall away from her, and her posture straightened. As if pulled by an invisible string, she rose unsteadily to her feet. "A baby," she whispered, the words filled with a strange, aching reverence. It was then that Ethan saw the subtle shift in her body. She took a sharp, involuntary breath. Her hand flew to her chest, pressing against the bodice of her wet dress. A look of profound anguish and confusion washed over her features. It was a deeply personal, intimate gesture, one he did not understand, but which radiated a pain so real it was unnerving. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken things. The woman, Abigail, took a hesitant step toward the cradle, her eyes never leaving Grace. The maternal instinct in her was a palpable force, a magnet pulling her toward the sound of a suffering child. "Please," she said, her voice now a desperate plea, but it wasn't for shelter anymore. It was for something else. "The baby, she is hungry." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a certainty that unnerved him. "She won't take goat's milk," Ethan said, the admission tasting like failure on his tongue. He still hadn't lowered the rifle. Abigail's eyes met his, and in their depths, he saw a mirror of his own desperation, his own grief. Tears welled, freezing on her lashes, and began to trace clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. I can help," she stammered, her hand still pressed to her chest. "Sir, you must believe me. This may be God's own will, cruel as it is." "What are you talking about?" Ethan's voice was low, suspicious. Her composure finally broke. A sob escaped her, raw and wounded. "I had a son," she said, the words torn from her. "Daniel, he was born 2 months ago." She choked on the past tense. "The fever took him from me just a month past. It took my boy." Ethan's heart seized. The fever. He knew that thief. He slowly, finally, lowered the barrel of the Winchester. He saw now that the danger wasn't in her hands, but in the shattering grief she carried. She was not a threat. She was a fellow survivor of the same shipwreck. "But my body," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, her gaze turning inward to a private sorrow. "It does not yet know he is gone. It still prepares for him." Her meaning, shocking and unbelievable, dawned on Ethan. She looked back at him, her eyes pleading, swimming with tears. "When I heard your daughter cry, I felt it. The milk. It is a mother's curse and a blessing all at once. Please, sir, I know this is a forward and unholy thing to ask of a stranger, but I cannot bear to let a child starve when God has left me with this memory of my own. Let me feed her." The room spun. The fire, the howling wind, the crying child, it all receded into a dull roar in his ears. For days, he had been praying for a miracle, and it had arrived in the most impossible form, a grieving mother, lost in a storm, carrying the one thing that could save his child. It was a gift wrapped in sorrow, a solution born from another's tragedy. He felt the last of his strength, the last of his resistance, crumble into dust. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. A single, jerky movement. He stepped back from the hearth, gesturing with the rifle barrel toward the cradle. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. Abigail moved as if in a dream. She shed her frozen shawl, her hands trembling, and knelt by the cradle, with a tenderness that made Ethan's throat ache. She gathered Grace into her arms. She sank into the rocking chair, Eleanor's chair, and settled the whimpering baby against her. She fumbled with the buttons of her bodice. Ethan, feeling like an intruder in this sacred, desperate moment, turned away, staring into the fire, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He heard a soft rustling, then a tiny, searching sound, and then silence. A profound, absolute, and miraculous silence. The crying had stopped. He turned back. The sight before him would be seared into his memory for all his days. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow on the scene. Abigail sat in the rocking chair, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face as she looked down at the child in her arms. And Grace, his Grace, was nursing, her tiny hands kneading, her body finally, blessedly still. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind, and the soft, contented sighs of a baby who had found life in the arms of a stranger. The rifle slipped from Ethan's numb fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. The strength that had held him upright for 3 days of hell vanished. His legs gave out, and he sank into the chair opposite her, a heap of frayed nerves and bone-deep exhaustion. He put his head in his hands, and a shudder racked his body. The knot of fear and grief he had carried for so long finally broke. He wept, not with loud, noisy sobs, but with the silent, shoulder-shaking tears of a man who had been pushed to the very edge of the abyss and had, by some impossible grace, been pulled back. The lone mountain man sat with his hungry baby, broken and defeated, until she knocked at the door. And, in the heart of the unforgiving winter, in a cabin battered by the storm, 2 strangers, bound by a shared and terrible grief, brought comfort to each other and saved a life. The storm broke with the dawn. After a night of furious violence, the wind sighed into silence, leaving behind a world transformed. A deep, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, smoothing the harsh angles of the land into soft, white curves. The morning sun, when it finally crested the peaks, struck 1,000,000 tiny crystals, setting the landscape ablaze with a cold, dazzling fire. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of presence. The incessant, frantic crying that had been the backdrop to Ethan's life for days was gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a contented baby. Ethan woke stiffly from the hard wooden chair he'd finally slumped into. For a few disoriented seconds, the silence felt wrong, alarming. Then he saw her. Abigail Hayes was asleep in Eleanor's rocking chair, her head slumped to one side. A quilt he didn't remember fetching draped over her shoulders, in the cradle beside her. Grace slept soundly, her tiny face peaceful for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The scene was one of impossible domesticity, a stranger in his wife's chair, watching over his child. A wave of complex emotions washed over him, gratitude so profound it was painful, mixed with a sharp pang of grief and a disorienting sense of intrusion. This wasn't right, yet it was the only thing that was. He moved quietly, stoking the embers in the hearth and adding fresh logs. The fire, which had been a desperate bastion against the cold, now felt like the center of this new, fragile reality. It was a source of life, a quiet promise of warmth in a world that had offered none. When Abigail eventually stirred, the awkwardness between them was a tangible thing. They were two strangers bound by the most intimate of circumstances. She had saved his daughter's life. He had given a lost woman shelter. The debt between them was immeasurable, and neither knew the currency to repay it. "Thank you," Ethan said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He held out a tin mug of hot coffee. She took it, her hands still trembling slightly from cold and exhaustion. "I should be thanking you," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. "For the shelter." There was a long silence, filled only by the crackle of the fire. The question of what came next hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The road to Sage Creek would be impassable for days, maybe weeks. Her own journey, wherever it was taking her, was indefinitely paused. And Grace would be hungry again in a few hours. The decision was made without a single word being exchanged. It was a simple, stark reality they both understood. She could not leave, and he could not let her go. She needed a roof and a fire. His daughter needed the life she could give. And so, Abigail Hayes stayed. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm, a quiet dance of necessity. Their lives, once solitary and shattered, began to weave together out of the simple, repetitive tasks of survival. Ethan's world was outside. Each morning before sunrise, he would pull on his heavy coat and step into the biting cold. The crisp, clean air was a relief from the emotionally charged atmosphere of the cabin. His work was hard, physical, and blessedly straightforward. He'd spend hours with his axe, the rhythmic thwack against seasoned pine a steady heartbeat in the vast silence. He cleared a path to the barn, his shovel cutting through the deep drifts. He cared for his two sturdy horses, Solomon and Sheba, and the milk goat, their animal presence a simple, uncomplicated comfort. He was a man who understood the language of work, and he threw himself into it, finding a semblance of peace in the burn of his muscles and the tangible results of his labor. Abigail's world was inside. She brought a quiet order to the small cabin, a space that had been slowly succumbing to a man's grief-stricken neglect. She found a routine dictated by Grace's needs. Feedings became quiet moments of communion. In between, she cooked. The scent of simmering venison stew and freshly baked cornbread began to fill the cabin, chasing away the stale smell of sorrow. She found Eleanor's sewing basket and mended the small tears in Ethan's shirts, her stitches neat and even. She washed their clothes in a large wooden basin, using water Ethan hauled from the well and heated over the fire. These were not the actions of a guest, but of a woman making a place for herself, driven by an instinct to create order from chaos. For Abigail, the work was a balm. It kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling in the dark. silent place where the memory of her son, Daniel, lived. Caring for Grace was both a comfort and a constant, aching reminder of what she had lost. Sometimes, when she held the warm, living weight of the baby in her arms, a genuine, unburdened smile would touch her lips. At other times, Ethan would see her looking down at Grace with an expression of such profound sadness that he would have to turn away, feeling as if he were spying on a private, sacred grief. They spoke very little. Their communication was a language of gestures. He would leave a stack of perfectly split kindling by the hearth each evening, far more than she needed for the night. She, in turn, would ensure a plate of warm food and a hot mug of coffee were waiting for him on the table when he returned, half frozen, from the barn. He noticed the bucket by the door was heavy for her, and one afternoon he took his knife and carved the handle, smoothing down the rough edges until it fit comfortably in a smaller hand. She noticed he was using a torn rag for a potholder and sewed him a new one from a scrap of thick canvas, padded with old wool. These small, silent offerings were the only way they knew how to say what they couldn't speak aloud. "I see you. I am grateful. We are in this together." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan began to change. The hard shell of his grief, the gruff and solitary nature he had cultivated, began to crack. He found himself watching her. He'd watched the efficient way she moved around the cabin, the gentle way she bathed Grace, the sad, faraway look in her eyes when she hummed a lullaby he didn't recognize. He had been so consumed by his own loss that he had forgotten how to truly see another person. Now, he was learning again. He wasn't just observing a stranger. He was witnessing the quiet, stubborn resilience of a woman piecing her life back together, one small act at a time. One evening, he came in from the cold to find her struggling to thread a needle in the dim lamplight. Without a word, he took another lamp from the mantel, cleaned the soot from the glass, and lit it, placing it on the table beside her. The circle of light brightened, and she looked up at him, a flicker of surprise in her blue eyes. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his name. "It's nothing," he mumbled, retreating to the safety of his side of the hearth. But it wasn't nothing. It was a step across the silent divide that separated them. Yet, for all the growing familiarity of their days, their evenings remained a testament to the chasm between them. After the supper dishes were cleared and Grace was asleep in her cradle, a heavy silence would descend. They would sit on opposite sides of the fire, the flames dancing between them, a shared source of warmth that also served as a clear line of demarcation. The fire was their focal point, a silent third presence in the room. They would stare into its depths, seemingly lost in their own thoughts, yet acutely aware of each other. The log walls of the cabin would shrink. The howling of a distant coyote would underscore their isolation, and the reality of their situation would press in on them. They were a man and a woman, unmarried, unrelated, living under one roof. It was an arrangement born of desperation, but its continuation was a question mark that neither of them dared to address. They were ghosts in each other's lives, coexisting in a space haunted by the specters of those they had lost. He never spoke of Eleanor. She never spoke of Daniel, or of the husband she had been traveling to meet when her wagon broke down. Their pasts were minefields of pain, and they trod carefully around them, terrified that a single misstep would detonate the fragile peace they had constructed. The future was an even greater terror, a blank, white canvas like the snow-covered world outside. Thinking about tomorrow was a luxury neither of them could afford. There was only today. There was only the next chore, the next meal, the next feeding. One night, the cold was particularly bitter. The frost on the window panes was thick as fur. Ethan had just come in from a final check on the animals, the chill clinging to him like a shroud. Abigail sat by the fire, rocking the cradle with her foot. Grace was fussing, a small, unhappy sound in the quiet. Abigail began to hum. It was the same sad, gentle tune he'd heard before, a melody that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. As he watched, she reached into the cradle and let Grace's tiny hand curl around her finger. "There now," she murmured, her voice just for the baby. "Hush now. The world is a cold place, but the fire is warm." Ethan stood by the door, unseen in the shadows. He wasn't just watching a woman comfort his child. He was watching hope being rekindled, ember by fragile ember. In the heart of that brutal Wyoming winter, in the shared space between two profound griefs, the quiet, steady flame in the hearth was more than just a defense against the cold. It was the promise that even after the most devastating storms, life, in its quiet, stubborn way, could find a reason to go on. The great thaw came in fits and starts. For weeks, the world outside the cabin was a shifting landscape of brilliant sun on snow, followed by gray, weeping skies. The snowpack, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, began to shrink, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. The streams, long silenced by ice, began to whisper again, then gurgle, then roar. The world was coming back to life, and with it, the world of men. Their isolation, which had been a protective cocoon, was ending. Their supply of flour was low. They were nearly out of salt and coffee, and Grace was outgrowing the few garments Eleanor had sewn. A trip to Sage Creek was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Ethan announced it one morning, his tone clipped and practical. "I'm riding to town. We need supplies." Abigail, who was folding a piece of linen, paused. A shadow of anxiety crossed her face. "It is safe, the roads." "The lower pass is clear enough for a horse," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I'll be back by nightfall." The unspoken part of his decision hung between them. He was going alone. It was a choice made to shield her, to keep their strange, fragile world intact for a few hours longer. But the act of leaving was itself a breach. For the first time, the outside world was pulling one of them away, a reminder that their life in the cabin was not, and could never be, the whole world. He returned late that evening, the saddlebags of his horse, Solomon, bulging with provisions. He was caked in mud and weary from the long ride. But there was a new tension in his shoulders, a hard, guarded look in his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. He unpacked the supplies in a grim silence, setting a sack of flour on the table with more force than was necessary. "Is everything all right, Ethan?" Abigail asked softly. "Fine," he grunted. "Town's the same as always." But it wasn't fine. She could feel the change in him. The comfortable silence they had built over the past weeks had been replaced by a strained, brittle quiet. The cold he'd brought in with him wasn't just from the trail. It was a chill that came from the town, and it settled deep in the corners of their small cabin. Ethan had felt it the moment he'd tied Solomon to the hitching post outside Miller's general store. The stares, the way conversations would halt as he walked past, only to resume in hushed whispers. Sam Miller, the storekeeper, a man he'd known for years, suddenly couldn't quite meet his eye. "Heard the winter was rough on you. Coal," Miller had said, busying himself by weighing out a bag of beans. "Losing your wife and all." "It was," Ethan had replied, his voice flat. "Folks were worried. Then we heard you had company. A woman." Miller cleared his throat. "Found her in the storm, they say." "They say right," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low growl that discouraged further questions. But the damage was done. The looks from the other men in the store a mixture of pity, crude curiosity, and judgment followed him out the door. The town had passed its verdict. A week later, that verdict arrived at their doorstep. It came in the form of Martha Gable, the wife of a rancher whose property bordered Ethan's land miles to the south. She arrived on a sway-backed mare, her face a mask of pious concern. "I just had to come and see for myself that you were all right, my dear," she said to Abigail, her eyes scanning every inch of the cabin, lingering on the single bed frame in the corner and the cradle beside it. "When we heard that Mr. Cole had taken in a woman in your unfortunate circumstances, we were so worried for your reputation." Every word was a carefully placed stone. Abigail stood frozen, a dish towel clutched in her hand, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. She was being judged, weighed, and found wanting. She was the subject of gossip, a story told for the entertainment of others. The kindness and necessity of her arrangement with Ethan were being twisted into something sordid and shameful. After Martha Gable left, leaving a trail of saccharine platitudes and veiled insults, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. Abigail could no longer look at her surroundings without seeing them through the town's eyes. She was a widow. Her fiancé, whom she had been traveling to marry, had died of fever the previous autumn, a fact she hadn't yet shared with Ethan, living with a widower. In the eyes of the world, that made her a fallen woman, and him a man of questionable morals. A terrible, corrosive guilt began to eat at her. She felt she was dishonoring the memory of Ethan's wife. She was sleeping under Eleanor's roof, eating from her plates, sitting in her rocking chair, and caring for her child. Every act of domesticity now felt like a transgression. She imagined Eleanor's ghost watching her, a silent, reproachful presence. Was she taking the place of the woman who should have been here? Was her very presence an insult to a love she had never known? She began to pull away from Ethan. The small, easy gestures between them ceased. She kept her eyes downcast, her answers to his questions short and clipped. The cabin, once a shared sanctuary, became a tense, divided territory. The breaking point came one night. After a day of suffocating silence, Ethan found her standing by the small, rough-hewn mantel, staring at the cabin's only photograph, a small, faded tintype of him and Eleanor, taken on their wedding day. In the picture, a younger Ethan was smiling, a rare, unguarded expression on his face, his arm possessively around a dark-haired woman whose eyes shone with a fierce, happy light. Her name was Eleanor, Ethan said, his voice quiet behind her. Abigail jumped, startled. She hadn't heard him approach. "She was beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It felt like jealousy, grief, and apology all at once. He came to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the photograph. The silence stretched, but this time it was different. It was a silence of remembrance. "She was stubborn," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "And she had a laugh that could make the birds in the trees stop to listen. She believed this place." He gestured around the cabin. "Could be a paradise. Said the mountains had strong bones. She wanted to fill it with children, with a life." He spoke haltingly, the words rusty from disuse. But as he continued, the memories seemed to flow more easily. He told Abigail about the day they met, about how she'd taught him a verse from the Bible, even though he wasn't a church-going man, about the time she'd faced down a rattlesnake with nothing but a garden hoe and a look of pure indignation. He wasn't just talking about a dead wife. He was bringing Eleanor to life in the space between them, honoring her, giving her a presence that wasn't a ghost but a cherished memory. As she listened, Abigail felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. His vulnerability was an invitation. His willingness to share his pain made room for hers. When he finally fell silent, his gaze lost in the flickering firelight, she reached into the small sewing basket by her side. Her fingers closed around a tiny, misshapen bundle of wool. "His name was Daniel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled out a single, flawlessly knitted baby bootie, no bigger than her thumb. "He was so small. His hair was as fine as corn silk. He only lived for 5 weeks. Now it was her turn. She spoke of the man she was supposed to marry, a good, steady man killed by the same autumn fever that had almost taken her. She spoke of her journey west to join him, a journey she'd continued because she had nowhere else to go and the baby inside her was her only reason to keep breathing. She told him of Daniel's birth in a lonely boarding house and of the terrifying speed with which the sickness had taken him. She didn't cry. Her grief was a dry, hollow ache, a place beyond tears. In the quiet, firelit cabin, two worlds of sorrow touched. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by a storm. They were two people who had looked into the same abyss. He understood the finality of a last breath. She understood the emptiness of a cradle that would never be used again. In the sharing of their stories, they had given each other the most profound gift, the knowledge that they were not alone in their pain. A fragile, tentative empathy began to stitch their two broken hearts together. A few nights later, the new intimacy that had grown between them was tested. Abigail sat in the rocking chair, nursing Grace. The baby was making soft, contented sounds, her eyes closed in blissful satisfaction. Ethan sat at the table, mending a piece of tack, but his hands were still. He was watching them. The firelight softened the lines of exhaustion on Abigail's face, casting a halo-like glow around her bent head. The sight was one of perfect, peaceful motherhood. It was life. It was Grace. It was everything he had lost and everything this woman had brought back into his home. A powerful, unfamiliar emotion surged through him, a mix of fierce gratitude, tender reverence, and an aching loneliness he hadn't realized he still felt. It wasn't the simple desire of a man for a woman. It was deeper, more complicated, and it scared him. He felt his face flush, and he quickly looked down, fumbling with the leather strap in his hands as if it were the most important task in the world. Abigail felt his gaze. She looked up and saw the quick, flustered way he turned away. His shy reverence was more intimate than any bold advance. It acknowledged the quiet miracle she performed each day, but it also highlighted the undeniable truth of their situation. A connection was forming between them, something that went beyond gratitude and necessity, and it terrified her. She had already lost a fiancé she'd loved and a son she'd adored. Her heart was a desolate, scarred landscape. The thought of allowing a new seed of affection to take root there was unbearable. Love, to her, had become synonymous with loss. To care for Ethan was to invite a future heartbreak she was certain she would not survive. For Ethan, the fear was different. The gossip from town, Abigail's recent withdrawal, and now this new, unnerving warmth he felt toward her, it all pointed to a terrifying possibility. This peace could be shattered. Abigail could decide the shame was too much to bear. She could leave. The warmth, the soft humming, the quiet order she had brought to his chaotic life, it could all vanish. He had survived the death of his wife. He was not sure he could survive his home becoming an empty, silent shell for a second time. They sat in the flickering light of the fire, separated by only a few feet of wooden floor, but miles of fear and uncertainty, each trapped in their own private dread, terrified of the very thing they were beginning to need the most, each other. The fragile peace born from their shared confession was a delicate thing, like the first thin sheet of ice on a pond, easily shattered. For a few days, the cabin was warmer, the silences less heavy, but the world outside their door was not so gentle. The winds that blew from Sage Creek carried more than just the scent of thawing earth. They carried whispers and whispers. In a place as small and tightly wound as a frontier town, had the force of a physical blow. The blow landed on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a high, clear blue, and a deceptively warm sun was melting the last stubborn patches of snow in the yard. Ethan was in the far pasture, mending a section of fence that had been brought down by the winter's weight. Abigail had left the cabin door open to let in the fresh spring air, a simple act of domestic optimism. Grace was asleep in her cradle, and, for a moment, a feeling of genuine, uncomplicated peace settled over Abigail. She heard the riders before she saw them, the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of male voices. She assumed it was a neighbor and moved to the doorway, a welcoming smile on her lips. They were two men she didn't recognize, rough-looking ranch hands returning from town, their faces flushed with sun and whiskey. They slowed their horses as they passed the open gate, their eyes lingering on her with a bold, appraising curiosity. Abigail's smile faltered. She felt a prickle of unease and took a half-step back into the shadows of the cabin. "Well, looky there," the first man said, his voice carrying with unnerving clarity in the still air. He nudged his companion. "That must be her, the lone mountain man's little wet nurse." The second man let out a low, coarse chuckle. "Heard she's trading her milk for a warm bed. Smart woman." The words struck Abigail with the force of a physical slap. They were crude, ugly, and designed to wound. They landed directly on the rawest parts of her soul, her shame, her guilt, her feeling of being an imposter in this home. The fragile peace of the afternoon shattered into 1,000 pieces. The air she had welcomed into the cabin now felt poisoned. She stumbled back from the door as if she'd been burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her face was hot with a shame so intense it felt like a fever. They saw her not as a woman who had saved a child, not as a fellow soul weathering a storm of grief, but as something transactional, something cheap. They had stripped all the humanity, all the quiet dignity from her arrangement with Ethan, and left only the ugliest possible interpretation. And the most terrible part was the small, treacherous voice in her own mind that whispered, "Aren't they right?" Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She looked around the cabin, and suddenly everything felt alien. Eleanor's rocking chair, Eleanor's cooking pots, Eleanor's husband, Eleanor's child. She was a usurper, a parasite. The kindness Ethan had shown her was, in the eyes of the world, just a convenient payment for the service she provided. She was tainting him, tainting this home, tainting the memory of his wife with her presence. She had to leave. The thought was not a rational one. It was a primal, desperate instinct to flee, to escape the crushing weight of her own shame. She had to erase herself from this picture before she caused any more damage. But what about Grace? The thought was a spike of agony in her heart. She couldn't leave Grace. The baby was the one pure, innocent thing in this whole sorry mess. Leaving her behind was an unthinkable cruelty. In her frantic, spiraling panic, a terrible, twisted logic formed she had to take Grace with her. She would take the child away from this house of gossip and shame, find somewhere new, somewhere they wouldn't be judged. It made no sense she had no money, no destination, nowhere to go, but the panic was a storm in her mind, and it drowned out all reason. As if on cue, the weather began to turn. The brilliant blue sky vanished behind a sudden, bruised-looking bank of clouds rolling in from the north. A late spring squall, vicious and unpredictable. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to moan around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, rising shriek. The change was as swift and violent as the storm in Abigail's own soul. She moved with the frantic, jerky movements of a cornered animal. Her hands trembled as she bundled Grace, who was still sleeping soundly, into the thickest wool shawl she could find. She threw a few pieces of linen and her one precious memento, Daniel's tiny, knitted booty, into a small cloth sack. She didn't take a coat for herself, only her own thin shawl. There was no time. She couldn't bear to be in this cabin a moment longer. Couldn't bear the thought of facing Ethan and seeing the reflection of the world's judgment in his eyes. She scribbled a hasty, tear-blotted note on a piece of scrap paper. "I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you," and left it on the table. Then, with Grace clutched tightly to her chest, she slipped out the door and into the rising storm. The wind hit her instantly, a solid wall of freezing air that tore the breath from her lungs. The first flakes of snow, thick and wet, were already falling, plastering themselves to her face and hair. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and bent her head against the gale, making for the road. The world had already dissolved into a maelstrom of swirling white. Her only thought was to put distance between herself and the cabin, between herself and the shame. She didn't know where the road led, only that it led away, The snow began to fall in earnest, a blinding, disorienting curtain. The track she was following quickly disappeared. The cold, which had been a shock, began to seep into her bones, a deep, invasive chill. Grace, woken by the cold and the violent motion, began to cry. It was a thin, frightened wail, quickly snatched away by the wind. "Hush, little one, hush," Abigail murmured, her own teeth chattering. "We'll be safe soon." It was a lie, and she knew it. She stumbled, her worn boot catching on a hidden root. She fell to one knee in a deep drift, managing to shield Grace with her body. The snow was a cold, wet shock against her skin. Panic gave way to a dawning, terrifying horror at what she had done. She was lost, she was freezing, and she had brought this innocent child out into a blizzard to die. A sob of pure despair tore from her throat. She struggled back to her feet, her dress heavy with snow, her limbs growing numb and clumsy. She kept moving, driven now not by shame, but by the primal, desperate need to find shelter. Any shelter. But there was nothing. Only the endless, swirling white and the screaming of the wind. Back at the cabin, Ethan returned from the pasture, his shoulders aching, looking forward to the warmth of the fire and a quiet evening. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The cabin was cold, the fire was dying, and the door had been left slightly ajar. A small drift of snow collecting on the floorboards. "Abigail," he called out. The silence that answered him was heavy, absolute. Then he saw it. The cradle was empty. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than the wind outside, seized him. He saw the note on the table, his name scrawled on it. He snatched it up, his eyes scanning the tear-stained words. "Trouble I have caused you." It made no sense. He looked around the room, his gaze falling on the small sack that was missing from her things. She was gone. She had taken Grace and walked out into the teeth of the storm. He didn't waste a second. He threw on his heaviest sheepskin coat, grabbed his gloves, and ran for the barn. His mind a maelstrom of fury and terror. Fury at whatever had driven her to this, and a primal terror for the woman and child who had become the center of his world. He saddled Solomon with a desperate speed born of adrenaline. The big horse shifted uneasily, sensing the urgency and the violence of the storm. Ethan swung himself into the saddle and urged Solomon out into the blizzard. The world was a churning chaos. Visibility was near zero. He bent low over the horse's neck, shielding his face as best he could, his eyes straining to find any sign of a track in the rapidly accumulating snow. He found them, faint and already half erased, leading toward the main road. He dug his heels into Solomon's flanks, and the powerful horse plunged forward into the white abyss. It was a nightmare of a ride. The wind howled, and the snow stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the driving snow, the heaving of the great animal beneath him, and the frantic, desperate prayer repeating in his head, "Please, God, let me find them. Please." He almost missed them. In the whiteout, they were just a dark, huddled shape, a slight variation in the endless landscape of snow. He saw them at the last moment, a small mound at the base of a snow-covered pine. He threw himself from the saddle before Solomon had even come to a full stop and plunged through the deep drifts toward them. It was Abigail. She was on her knees, her back to the wind, her body curled around the small bundle in her arms in a last, desperate attempt to shield it. Her shawl and hair were white with snow, her face deathly pale, her lips blue. She was shivering violently, her movements slow and uncoordinated. She was freezing to death. "Abigail!" he roared over the wind. She looked up, her eyes dazed, unfocused. She didn't seem to recognize him at first. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands going immediately to the bundle she was clutching. He pulled back the shawl. Grace's face was pale and still, her eyes closed. For one heart-stopping second, he thought he was too late. Then he saw the faint puff of her breath in the cold air. She was alive. Relief. So powerful it almost buckled him, washed through him. He turned his attention back to Abigail. Her eyes had cleared slightly, and in them he saw a universe of shame and despair.
I'm sorry,
she chattered, her voice barely audible.
They said I had to go. I'm sorry.
He shook his head, his own face a mask of anguish and fury. Sorry for what? He demanded, his voice raw.
For taking her place,
Abigail whispered, a single tear freezing on her cheek.
For being here.
He reached out and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His face was inches from hers, his eyes blazing with an intensity that burned through her cold-induced daze. Listen to me, he said, his voice hard with emotion. You listen to me now. You are not the woman who took something from me. He paused, letting the words sink in, a direct and powerful rebuttal to the guilt that had been poisoning her. He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Abigail, he said, his voice softening, breaking with the sheer force of what he was about to say. You're the one giving her life. The truth of it, stark and simple and absolute, hung between them in the heart of the storm. She wasn't a replacement. She was a savior. She wasn't a source of shame. She was the reason his daughter was still alive. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and she finally sagged against him. The last of her strength gone, he acted quickly, pulling off his own heavy coat and wrapping it around both her and Grace, cocooning them in his warmth. He lifted them both, they weighed almost nothing, and carried them through the deep snow to the waiting horse. He settled them in the saddle, then swung up behind them, creating a human shield against the fury of the storm. He turned Solomon back toward the faint, guiding light of the cabin. As they rode, the snow fell thick and silent around them, covering their tracks, blanketing the world in a pristine, purifying white. They had gone out into the storm as three separate, broken souls, and were returning as one, forged together by the fire of desperation and the cleansing cold of the snow. The first thing she felt was warmth. It was not the fleeting, desperate heat of a dying fire, but a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be seeping into her very bones, chasing away the memory of a cold so profound it had felt like death itself. The second thing she heard was the gentle, rhythmic crackle of a well-fed fire and the soft, steady breathing of a sleeping child. The storm was gone. Its violent shriek had been replaced by a profound, muffled silence that spoke of a world buried in peace. Abigail's eyes fluttered open. The light was soft, filtered. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the blinding white, the razor-edged cold, and Ethan's face, fierce and anguished, materializing out of the blizzard like an avenging angel. Then, awareness returned in a painful, searing flood. She was in the cabin. She was lying in Ethan's bed, tucked under a mountain of heavy quilts and woolen blankets. Her wet, frozen clothes were gone, replaced by a soft, worn nightgown that she recognized vaguely as one of Eleanor's. The shame of it all washed over her, a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She had panicked, she had run, she had nearly killed herself, and, unforgivably, she had nearly killed Grace. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her body protesting with a deep, aching exhaustion. The cabin was dim and quiet, and there, in the chair by the hearth, was Grace, sleeping soundly in her cradle, her tiny face serene, her chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of life. She was safe. She was warm. Abigail's gaze moved from the cradle to the figure sitting in the other chair, the one beside the bed. It was Ethan. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting perfectly still, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He was simply watching her, and he looked as though he had been watching her for a very long time. His face was a landscape of exhaustion, His dark hair was disheveled, a dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a redness that spoke of a long, sleepless, and terrifying night. He looked older, harder, as if the last 12 hours had carved new lines of hardship into his face. But as his eyes met hers, she saw no anger, no judgment, only a bone-deep weariness and a profound, overwhelming relief that seemed to hold him in his chair.
Grace,
She whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy thing.
she's fine.
Ethan answered, his own voice low and gravelly with fatigue.
Fed her the last of the goat's milk you'd warmed.
She slept right through. He didn't move.
How do you feel?
She didn't know how to answer. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest.
Ethan, I'm so sorry.
The words were wholly inadequate. A tiny pebble offered an apology for an avalanche.
I don't know what I was thinking. I put her in such danger.
Stop, he said. The word wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. It cut through her frantic apologies and left a ringing silence in its wake. He finally moved, leaning forward, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were looking directly into her soul.
There's nothing for you to be sorry for.
I heard them. Abigail flinched.
You heard those men?
I didn't hear them, he clarified, a muscle tightening in his jaw. But I know the kinds of things men like that say. I heard it in the silence in Miller's store. I saw it in the way Martha Gable looked at you. It was my fault. I brought you into this, and I didn't protect you from it. The shame is mine, Abigail, not yours. His defense of her, so fierce and immediate, was a balm to her wounded spirit, but it did not absolve her.
But to run, to take Grace into the storm,
it was madness. It was fear, he corrected softly, and I understand fear. He fell silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to his own calloused hands. The fire crackled, filling the space between them. When he looked up again, the exhaustion in his eyes was mingled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He looked like a man about to leap from a cliff, unsure if he would find solid ground or the empty air.
When I came back to the cabin,
he began, his voice barely above a whisper,
and I saw that empty cradle. I thought I knew what it was to lose everything. When Eleanor died, my world ended. But last night, standing in that cold room, I realized I was wrong. I had something left to lose. I had Grace, and I had... He stopped, the word catching in his throat. He took a deep breath, a man gathering all the courage he possessed.
I had you. Abigail's heart seemed to stop. The air grew thick, charged with the weight of his unspoken feelings.
This place,
he continued, gesturing vaguely at the log walls around them.
It was just a shell, a tomb. I was just
waiting. I don't know for what. An end, I suppose. Then you came. You knocked on the door, and you brought the sound of life back into this house. You brought my daughter back from the brink of death. You brought warmth and order and hope. I won't let the cruel whispers of fools take that away. I won't let your fear take that away. He rose from his chair and came to kneel by the side of the bed. The movement was slow, deliberate, a gesture of supplication. He was a proud, solitary man. And this act of humility cost him everything. He looked at her, his red-rimmed eyes pleading, stripped of all pride, all pretense. "Stay, Abigail," he said, the words a raw, broken prayer. "Not just for tonight, not just until the road is clear or until Grace is weaned. Stay." He took another breath, the hardest one yet, and delivered the final, devastating plea. "Stay and be her mother." The words hung in the air, immense and terrifying and beautiful. He wasn't asking her to be a wet nurse. He wasn't asking her to be a housekeeper. He was asking her to be a wife, a partner. He was asking her to take the empty, shattered pieces of their lives and build a family. He was offering her a home. Her first instinctual reaction was a silent, screaming no. Her heart clenched into a tight, painful fist. To be a mother again, to love a child as her own, knowing how easily, how cruelly, that love could be snatched away. The ghost of Daniel's tiny hand seemed to curl around her heart. A cold, sad memory. And to be a wife, to stand in Eleanor's place, to love this man, knowing that his heart would always hold the perfect, unblemished memory of his first love. It was impossible. She was not worthy. She was a stand-in, a replacement, a convenient solution to a desperate problem. Love, for her, was a prelude to agony. Her heart was a graveyard, and she was terrified to plant a single new flower in its poisoned soil.
"I can't,"
she whispered, the words tasting of ash.
"Ethan, I am not her. I am not Eleanor. I can't take her place."
"I'm not asking you to," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "No one could ever take Eleanor's place, just as no one could take the place of your Daniel. Their places are theirs, forever. I'm asking you to make your own place, here, with us." He reached out and, with a hesitation that spoke volumes, gently took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "We're two broken people, Abigail," he said. "Maybe broken things can't be made whole again, but maybe they can be put together to make something new, something strong enough to stand against the storms." She looked from his earnest, desperate face to the cradle where Grace slept, a perfect, innocent miracle. She had saved this child's life, but this child, in turn, had given her a reason to live, a purpose in the bleak emptiness after Daniel's death. And this man, this quiet, strong, grieving man, had seen past her sorrow and her shame, and had offered her not just shelter, but a home, a place. For weeks, they had been merely surviving. He was asking her to choose to live. It was the most terrifying choice she had ever faced. To accept his offer was to open her heart to the possibility of unimaginable pain all over again. But to refuse was to choose to remain a ghost, to walk away from the only warmth she had known, to surrender to the fear that had almost killed her in the storm. It was a choice between the terrifying, uncertain promise of life and the safe, desolate certainty of a half-life spent alone. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his tired, hopeful eyes. She looked at the sleeping child who was the living, breathing heart of this home, and she made her choice. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release.
"I will stay,"
she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time. The tension in Ethan's shoulders seemed to melt away. The relief on his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. He squeezed her hand. A silent, grateful acknowledgement of the monumental gift she had just given him. And then, for the first time since he had opened the door to find her in the storm, Abigail Hayes smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, fragile, watery thing. But it was genuine. It was a flicker of light in a dark room, a single, brave crocus pushing its way up through a world of snow. It was the smile of a woman who had chosen not just to survive, but to begin, finally, to live again. The decision to stay was not a magic cure. It did not erase the ghosts of Eleanor or Daniel, nor did it silence the phantom whispers from Sage Creek. Instead, it was like the careful, deliberate act of setting a broken bone. The pieces were aligned, but the healing would be a long, slow, and painful process, requiring stillness, patience, and a quiet strength neither Ethan nor Abigail was sure they possessed. Yet a change had occurred, as real and tangible as the return of green to the aspen trees on the mountainside. The cabin, which had been a temporary shelter, began to feel like a home, their shared existence. Once a silent negotiation of chores and boundaries, softened into a partnership. They spoke more, sharing small observations about the weather, the progress of the garden they'd tilled together behind the cabin, or the new, gurgling laugh Grace had developed. It was in these small moments that a new foundation was being laid. Ethan found himself talking about his plans for the farm, ideas he hadn't spoken aloud since Eleanor's death. He spoke of clearing the upper meadow for more grazing land, of building a proper spring house to keep milk and butter cool. He wasn't just speaking of his own future anymore. He was, without saying it, speaking of theirs. Abigail, in turn, began to fill the cabin with a life that was uniquely hers. She planted wild columbine flowers in a small patch by the door and hung bundles of dried herbs from the rafters, filling the space with a sense of sage and thyme. One bright afternoon, nearly a month after the blizzard, they were sitting on the porch steps, watching Grace kick her feet happily on a blanket in the sun. It was a moment of such profound, simple peace that it felt almost stolen. The air was warm. The sky was a vast, unbroken blue. And for the first time, the future did not feel like a threat, but a quiet, sunlit path stretching before them. It was this very peace that made the arrival of the three riders so jarring. They appeared at the far end of the lane, three dark figures on horseback moving with a purpose that was immediately unsettling. These were not neighbors paying a social call. Ethan's body went still, his hand, which had been resting on the step beside Abigail's, instinctively tightening into a fist. He felt her tense beside him. "Go inside," he said, his voice a low, flat command that held no room for argument. "Take Grace and stay away from the window." Abigail didn't hesitate. She scooped the baby from the blanket, her heart beginning a low, fearful drumbeat against her ribs. She cast one worried look back at Ethan, who was already on his feet, his body a solid, unmoving wall between his home and the approaching threat. She hurried inside, latching the door but unable to follow his final instruction. She moved to the side of the small window, positioning herself so she could see without being seen. Grace clutched tightly to her chest. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, with a portly belly, a prosperous suit ill-suited for the trail, and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of smug superiority. Abigail recognized him as Jedediah Thorne, the owner of the largest saloon in Sage Creek, and a man known for lending money at ruinous rates. The two men flanking him were of a different sort, entirely lean. Hard-faced men with revolvers strapped low on their hips, their eyes cold and empty as river stones. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, stirring up a cloud of dust that shimmered in the afternoon sun. "Cole," Thorne said, his voice oily and loud. He did not dismount. "We've come on business." "I have no business with you, Thorne," Ethan replied, his voice dangerously quiet. His hands were loose at his sides, but Abigail could see the coiled tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. Thorne chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Oh, but you do. Or rather, your brother's business is now yours." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, holding it up like a trophy. "I have here a deed, signed and witnessed. Your brother, Silas, had a run of bad luck at the card table. A very, very long run. As it turns out, his debt is precisely the value of this plot of land. He signed it over to me, free and clear." From inside, Abigail gasped. She had heard Ethan speak of his older brother only once, his words clipped and bitter. Silas was a ghost in Ethan's life, a man who had fled the hardships of the farm years ago for the easy promises of saloons and gambling halls. Ethan's face remained a mask of stone, but a flicker of something resigned fury perhaps passed through his eyes. He had known, somewhere deep down, that his brother's irresponsibility would one day find its way to his door. "That piece of paper was signed by a man who has no claim to this land," Ethan said, his voice as cold and hard as granite. "He abandoned this place 10 years ago. The law says otherwise." Thorne countered, his smile widening. "His name is on the original title, alongside your father's. That gives him a share he has legally signed over to me. I'm here to collect my property. Cole, I've come to take possession."
One of the hired men, emboldened by Thorne's confidence, made a move to swing down from his horse. "Stay where you are." Ethan's voice cracked like a whip. It was not loud, but it stopped the man cold. "Now, there's no need for unpleasantness," Thorne said, though his eyes glinted with the prospect of it. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. You pack up your belongings." He let his gaze slide deliberately over the cabin, a clear and insulting reference to Abigail and Grace. "And ride out. I'll even be generous and forget about the back taxes Silas neglected to mention." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to look right through Thorne, his focus on a point far beyond. "This land was my father's," he said, his voice low and resonant, each word carefully weighed. "He broke his back clearing these trees. I built this cabin with my own 2 hands, right where he told me to. My wife," his voice caught for a fraction of a second, "is buried on that hill, under the big pine. My daughter was born in this house." He finally fixed his eyes on Thorne, and they were like chips of gray flint. "Your piece of paper means nothing here. This is my home." "Behind the window?" Abigail held her breath. He hadn't said my house, he had said my home. The distinction was everything. A house was wood and nails. A home was the life within it. In that single sentence, he had drawn a line in the dirt, and she and Grace were standing on his side of it. "He's just one man," one of the hired guns muttered to Thorne, his hand drifting toward the butt of his pistol. It was the only provocation Ethan needed. He didn't rush. He didn't make a sound. He simply turned, took 3 deliberate steps back into the cabin, and emerged a moment later with the long, dark barrel of his Winchester rifle in his hands. He didn't raise it to his shoulder. He didn't aim it. He held it cradled in the crook of his arm, the muzzle pointing toward the ground. But the presence of the rifle changed everything. It was no longer a discussion about paper and law. It was a statement of finality. "The law of Sage Creek might be written on paper." "Thorne," Ethan said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "The law on this mountain is written in stone and steel. You are not welcome here. I am telling you, for the first and last time, to get off my land." Thorne's smug expression began to curdle. This was not the simple eviction he had envisioned. He looked at Ethan, and he did not see a frightened homesteader he could easily bully. He saw a man who had been stripped of everything once before and had nothing left to fear. He saw a man who was not defending a property, but a principle, the principle of home. Abigail watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the window frame. She had seen this rifle before, the night she arrived. It had been pointed at her chest, a tool of fear and suspicion. Now, in Ethan's hands, it looked completely different. It was not an instrument of aggression. It was a shield. It was an extension of his will, a silent, deadly promise that he would not be moved. She looked at him standing there, solitary and resolute against 3 armed men, and she felt not fear, but a fierce, soaring pride. He was not just protecting her from a physical threat. He was standing in the gap, shielding her from the judgment and greed of the outside world. He was defending her honor, their honor, with a courage that went far beyond mere physical bravery. He was the man who had pulled her from the snow, but this was the moment she understood that he had also saved her from a different kind of oblivion. "You're a fool, Cole," Thorne blustered, his voice losing its confident edge. "You can't win this." "I'm not trying to win," Ethan said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a chilling certainty. "I'm just making sure you lose." The 2 hired men exchanged a nervous glance. This wasn't what they were being paid for. They were bullies, not soldiers, and they had no interest in dying for Jedediah Thorne's bad investment. The look in Ethan Cole's eyes promised a fight, and it promised to be a bloody one. Thorne saw the shift in his men. He saw the unwavering resolve in Ethan. He had miscalculated. He had thought he was dealing with a broken, grieving man. He was, in fact, dealing with a father and a husband, in spirit, if not in law, and that was a far more dangerous creature. with a final, venomous glare. Thorn pulled hard on his reins, turning his horse. "This isn't over," he spat. "The law's on my side." "Then send the law," Ethan replied without moving. "Don't send thugs." Thorn and his men rode away, their retreat far less dignified than their arrival. Ethan stood on the porch, the Winchester held loosely in his arm, and watched until they were nothing more than small specks on the horizon. Only then did the rigid tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He lowered the rifle, broke it open to show it was empty of immediate threat, and leaned it against the cabin wall. He turned, and his eyes met Abigail's through the window. A long, silent moment passed between them. In his gaze, she saw the confirmation of everything she had just understood. He had not fought for land. He had fought for them. He had declared to the world that this cabin, this woman, this child, this was his family, and he would defend it to the last. The story of that afternoon would travel back to Sage Creek, but it would not be the one Thorn told. It would be the one his hired men told over cheap whiskey, the story of the quiet man on Lone Mountain who stood his ground alone, not with anger, but with a righteousness that was more intimidating than any bullet. The town's narrative began to shift. The whispers did not die, but they changed their tune. He was no longer the foolish widower shacked up with a fallen woman. He was the man who had stood, like the mountain he lived on, to protect the woman who had saved his child. He was a man of honor. 3 years. In the vast, untamed wilderness of Wyoming, 3 years was long enough for a river to carve a new path, for a forest fire to scar a mountain, and for new life to rise from the ashes. On the slopes of Lone Mountain, 3 years had been a lifetime. The small, defiant cabin that had once stood as a lonely bastion against the storm was no longer so small, nor so lonely. A new room had been added, built of the same sturdy pine. Its seams tight, its windows looking out over a valley that was slowly but surely being tamed. The fields Ethan had once dreamed of with Eleanor were no longer dreams. They were wide, green rectangles of hay and corn, wrested from the stubborn earth by the steady, unceasing labor of his hands. The single milk goat was gone, replaced by a small herd of cattle and 2 dairy cows that grazed peacefully in the upper meadow he had finally cleared. The farm was breathing again. It was alive. The greatest change, however, was in the sounds that filled the air. The mournful howl of the winter wind had been replaced by the bright, chiming laughter of a child. Grace Cole was a whirlwind in a pinafore, her hair the same dark shade as her father's, but her eyes held the clear, startling blue of the woman she called Mama. At 3 years old, she was a creature of boundless energy and fierce curiosity, a walking, talking embodiment of the life that had been so miraculously saved. She chased butterflies through the new fields, brought her father handfuls of wildflowers, and sat on a small stool in the cabin, chattering endlessly as Abigail moved about her work. The confrontation with Jedediah Thorn had not, as he'd promised, continued. Ethan, with a quiet resolve that surprised everyone in Sage Creek, had ridden to the territorial capital when the circuit judge was in session. He presented his case simply, without bluster. He spoke of his father's work, of his brother's abandonment, and of the home he had built. The judge, a man who had seen his share of frontier justice and land-grabbing schemes, looked at Ethan's calloused hands and steady eyes, then at the flimsy, whiskey-stained deed Thorn presented. He had nullified the claim. His verdict echoing through the town, a man's sweat and heart gave him a greater right to a piece of land than a gambler's desperate signature. The town's opinion, already shifting, solidified. Ethan Cole was not a man to be trifled with. He was a man who stood for what was his. And Abigail was his. They had married the following spring, in a quiet ceremony performed by the same circuit judge. There were no flowers, no guests, only the 3 of them standing on the courthouse steps, with the vast, windy plains as their witness.
It was not a marriage born of youthful passion or whirlwind romance. It was a union forged in the crucible of shared grief, tempered by mutual respect, and sealed with a conscious, deliberate choice to build a future together. The ghosts of their pasts had not vanished, but they had grown quiet, receding into the gentle landscape of memory. Eleanor's tintype still sat on the mantel, but now, beside it, was a small, carved wooden bird, a gift from Ethan to Abigail on their first anniversary. And in the bottom of Abigail's sewing basket, tucked away in a soft piece of linen, was a single, perfect baby booty. They were reminders not of what was lost, but of the winding, painful paths that had led them to each other. On a warm evening in late summer, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, Ethan came walking up from the barn. He was no longer the haunted, gaunt figure who had once stared into the heart of a blizzard. The harsh lines on his face had been softened by time and contentment. There was a peace in his eyes, a quiet confidence in his step. In his hands, he carried a small, wiry sapling, its roots bundled carefully in a piece of damp burlap. Abigail was sitting on the porch steps, her hands resting on the gentle, pronounced swell of her belly. She was pregnant, carrying the new life that was a testament to the future they had chosen to build. The shadows of sorrow that had once lived in her eyes were gone, replaced by a warm, steady light. She smiled as he approached. "What have you got there?" she asked, her voice holding the easy warmth of their life together. "A promise," he said, holding up the small tree. He sat down on the step beside her. "It's a white fir. Found it growing up high, near the timberline. They're the strongest trees on this mountain." Grace, hearing her father's voice, came running from the cabin, her small bare feet thumping on the wooden porch. "What is it, Papa?" "It's our tree, Gracie," he said, his voice softening as it always did when he spoke to her. "We're going to plant it. All of us." He led them not to the small garden, but out toward the fence line, to a gentle slope that overlooked the entire valley he had worked so hard to cultivate. It was the same spot where he had stood with his Winchester and faced down Thorn's greed. Now, they would reclaim it, not with steel, but with life. He had already dug the hole. It was deep and wide, the dark, rich earth piled neatly to one side. He knelt and, with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rough hands, he unwrapped the burlap from the sapling's roots and settled it into the ground. "All right, Abigail," he said, looking up at her. She came and knelt beside him, her movements slow and graceful. She held the thin trunk of the sapling steady while Ethan began to push the dark earth back into the hole, his hands working with a familiar, practiced rhythm. "Mama, can I help?" Grace asked, her eyes wide with the importance of the moment. "Of course, little one," Abigail said, smiling. She took Grace's small hands and guided them, showing her how to pat the soil down around the base of the young tree, firming its new foundation. They worked together in the golden light of the setting sun, a small trinity of purpose. The only sounds were the whisper of the evening breeze through the pines, the soft scrape of hands in the dirt, and Grace's happy, concentrated breathing. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their work. The small tree stood a little crooked, but it was firmly planted, its thin branches reaching for the vast, open sky. It looked small and fragile against the immense backdrop of the mountains, a tiny speck of green hope planted in the wilderness. Ethan put a hand on Grace's shoulder and drew her close. He looked at the sapling, then out at the rugged, beautiful land that had almost claimed them all. "The white fir survives through storm and snow," he said, his voice quiet, filled with a simple, profound truth. He turned his gaze to Abigail, his eyes full of a love that was deeper and stronger than any he had ever imagined. "So do we." Abigail's heart was so full she couldn't speak. She simply leaned into him, her hand covering his where it rested on her belly, feeling the faint, fluttering promise of the new life within. He was right. They had survived the blizzard that had first brought them together. They had survived the storms of grief, of fear, of shame, of the world's judgment. They had not just endured. They had grown. Their roots, once shallow and broken, had intertwined, digging deep into the rocky soil of this mountain, holding them fast. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The long shadows of the mountains stretched across their land, enveloping the small cabin, the growing fields, and the three figures standing beside the newly planted tree. They were a family, forged not by the easy bonds of blood, but by the harder, more resilient ties of choice and compassion. They were a testament to the quiet, stubborn power of the human heart to heal, to love, and to build a home in the most unforgiving of landscapes. For in the wild, untamed heart of the West, it's not always blood that makes a family, it's grace. Thank you for listening to our story here on Wild West Tales. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.